On this week's Muscle Car of the Week, it's one of the baddest Mustangs you could ever buy, a 70 Boss 429. In 1970, you could have gotten any number of high-performance Mustangs. I mean, there was base model cars, there was Mach 1s, there was GTs, there were Boss 302s, of course you could get any of the Shelby cars, and then you could get what many consider to be the king of the hill, the Boss 429. And this car, you know, they only made 500 of them or so, 499 originally in 1970, because of a NASCAR tie-in that we'll get into in a second. But a lot of people look at this car and see the giant engine and a very basic car and think, you know, this must have been a drag race version of a Mustang. But in reality, this thing has its roots solely planted on the super speedways of NASCAR. The big Boss 429 V8 came about as Ford was going to compete with Chrysler against the Hemi-headed 426s. The Ford version had a semi-hemispherical cylinder head which gave way to these giant valve covers and a super wide engine. And in NASCAR, you had to have 500 street versions of a particular engine to be sold legally on the street to be able to introduce that engine for competition in NASCAR racing. And the interesting part of how the Boss 429 Mustang came to be is if you look at it, Ford never raced a Mustang in NASCAR. You know, the cars that were racing in NASCAR were Torinos and Mercury Cyclones at that point. You never saw a Mustang on the track, so you'd think you'd be able to go to your Ford dealer and buy a Boss 429 Torino. Well, that never happened. They decided to put the Boss 429 NASCAR engine in a Mustang. And as I mentioned earlier, there was a variety of Mustangs you could buy. So to get this 429 under the hood of a Mustang, the front of the car required extensive modifications. I mean, if you look and see how wide this thing is, it just took a lot of work to get there. And Ford realized they had all kinds of different Mustang programs going on, so they enlisted a subcontractor called CarCraft, which was spelled with K's, and had them do the work to get the 429 motor in the nose of the 69 and 70 Boss 429 Mustangs. Now, CarCraft was already building the Boss 302 cars for Ford, so they knew the Mustang platform in and out. It wasn't that big of a deal for those guys. You'll see the shock towers have been widened. They changed the front suspension mounts and the engine mounts to bring everything down. But looking at this thing, it's kind of amazing to see that they used every available square inch to fit something, even a smog pump. This car has a factory installed smog pump with the air tubes that go into the exhaust. So I mean, it's amazing that they fit that on the car. It's even more amazing that it's still on this car, because these things were ripped off and thrown away many years ago by most people. There was some other modifications too. They changed the front spindles, the front spring rate's different, the sway bar is different, and once you put all these things together to get that thing under the hood, you could see why they had to relocate the battery to the trunk, because there just wasn't any room left. The Boss 429s have their own unique look, and part of it is that it's actually kind of boring looking, but if you pay attention, you'll notice they've got an aggressive stance, and again, that's because of the special suspension they put in these things. They sit a little bit lower than most of the other Mustangs. They've got a scoop on the hood that's blacked out. They don't have any other stripes or a rear wing or rear louvers or anything fancy to make them stand out, which makes them, you know, essentially kind of a sleeper. That 429 might be a beast under the hood, but the car's pretty comfortable if you look at it. It's fairly basic. It's got a pair of high back bucket seats. It's got a fold down rear seat. For instrumentation, you've got a 120 mile an hour speedometer, an 8,000 RPM tach, a fuel gauge, and a temp gauge. It didn't even have an oil pressure gauge, which is pretty surprising thinking, you know, of how powerful these engines were and how people would beat on these cars. You know, you want to know what's going on, but this thing didn't really tell you. You also have an AM radio down there, a basic heater with a blower, a Hurst T-handle shifter on the top loader 4-speed transmission, disc brakes, and a center console. And the passenger, like most 69 and 70 Mustangs, gets a clock to stare at. But of course, the coolest part of a Boss 429 is the Boss engine. And this thing starts as a 4-bolt main block, 429 cubic inches, 10.5 to 1 compression ratio. It's got a forged steel crankshaft. The cylinder heads are aluminum, and they're so big because to get the valve train to work with the semicircular hemispherical head design, they had to offset the valve train geometry, and that's what takes up so much room up there. One thing that's interesting about the Boss 429 heads is that they are an O-ring design. You don't have a traditional head gasket that you drop on and then bolt the heads down. You've got a whole assortment of O-rings that have to go around every coolant passage, every oil hole, every possible leak point. So putting one of these engines together is definitely challenging. You got to know what you're doing. Ford claimed that these things made 375 horsepower at 5,200 RPM and 450 foot-pounds of torque at 3,400 RPM. But this engine is the stuff of legends. People have been talking about it for years, that really they make over 500, and some people say they make over 600 horsepower. They've got a Holley 785 CFM carburetor and an aluminum intake, and those kind of numbers with the 429 cubic inch displacement are definitely possible. There have been dyno tests done over the years that said they made everything from mid 400s to just over 500 in stock form. Again, depending on who tunes them, and then depending on what other speed parts you add, nobody really knows. But the cool thing is that this is one of those mythical cars that even Ford apparently lied about the power numbers, because at that time the insurance companies were really starting to get wise to these cars, and if you had a high power number, they drove the insurance rate up, and Ford thought that would scare people away. Now, I've also heard that story about the insurance companies for years and years and years. I've never seen any proof in documentation that says that. Maybe someday we'll investigate if that's really true. We do know that sales weren't very good on these cars because it's a high compression race motor that didn't like to start in cold weather, didn't idle very well. It was made to spin at high RPM all day long. So driving them around on daily streets really wasn't any fun. This isn't a car you're going to get on a cold day and turn the key and expect to get to work on time. On the drag strip, these things were capable of 14-second quarter miles at 104 miles an hour. And then of course, road racing, they were great, but around town they were kind of miserable. But nevertheless, it's still one of the baddest Mustangs ever made. Other parts of the driveline include a beefed-up 4-speed transmission and a 391 rear axle with a traction lock differential. This car debuted in '69, but in 1970 they added a bunch of different colors to them: grabber green, grabber orange, grabber blue, calypso coral, and a pastel blue. So the colors got brighter for 1970. I don't know if that was an effort to attract more attention and sell more, but that's one of the big differences between 69 and 70 is the colors. Everything else is basically the same on those cars. So to have the Boss 429 engine be legal in NASCAR, Ford had to sell 500 versions on the street. The story is there was 499 Mustangs and a couple of Cougars done in 1970, so they reached that goal. But did they reach the goal of dominating NASCAR with the Boss 429? Doesn't look like it. I think Chrysler had more wins with the Hemi than Ford did with the Boss. But nevertheless, this is definitely a car in the Brothers collection that I would love to take out on any day of the week, and twice on Sunday. With tons of power, awesome performance, and great looks to match, it's no wonder that this car is one of the bosses of the Brothers collection. You can see more on our website at musclecaroftheweek.com. Also check out our Facebook page, and if you like what you see, share it with your friends. We're also going to post a teaser pic of next week's car so you can try and guess what it is. And if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, you'll never miss an episode of Muscle Car of the Week.